And welcome to our week 8 video on Wide Sargasso Sea. In this video, we're going to go through all of Wide Sargasso Sea. We're going to get through the whole book. If you've already started reading, you'll notice that the book is divided into different sections. We have a part 1, a part 2, and a part 3. So if you want, you can pause this video as we go through each of the sections. Maybe you've already read part 1 so far, so you're just going to go through part 1 right now and then come back to it. That's totally fine. One thing I would recommend doing if you are a note taker is pulling up the PowerPoint from the module that's going to follow along with this video. And so then you can be editing the PowerPoint and filling in the answers as we go through this video. Or of course you can take notes by hand if you want to do that as well. But again, we're going to be going through parts 1, 2, and 3 all together here in this video. If you haven't read any of the book yet, I would suggest go read some of the book and then come on back and join us for the video here. But now let's get into Wide Sargasso Sea. So what is Wide Sargasso Sea? Wide Sargasso Sea is a novel that was first published in 1966, and the author, Jean Rhys, is from the Dominican Republic. Now, what is really interesting about this story is that it provides a backstory for Bertha Mason, who is a character who originally appears in the novel Jane Eyre. Now, when we talk about Jane Eyre, when we talk about that novel, for a long time, Bertha Mason has been referred to as the mad woman in the attic in that story. And Jane Eyre was actually written originally by Charlotte Bronte and published in 1847. So we have an interesting situation where we have an author who writes one book and then generations later, another author comes along and basically says, I don't like what you did with that character. I think she needs more of a backstory. She didn't get the right treatment. Let's give her an origin story in Wide Sargasso Sea. So that's what we have happening here. Now, Jane Eyre is a classic. It's read in many English classes. There's another class at LTU that sometimes reads it, but it is problematic. There is racism and sexism in the story that the author Charlotte Bronte probably wasn't even fully aware of when she was writing it. It's seen sometimes as a very early feminist novel, and feminism at the time of Charlotte Bronte would have been different than how we see it today. It wouldn't have really been understood. We weren't quite to that point yet. But we do see a character in Jane Eyre who strives to show herself as being equal to a man. So in that way, we can see it being a pre-feminism type of novel. But again, the character Bertha Mason is seen as being mistreated and misunderstood in that story. So we have Jean Rhys saying, let's give her a background. As I said, let's give her an origin and see what would reach her to get to that point that she's at in that story. Can we understand how she reaches that mad woman stigma in Jane Eyre? So we're going to see that coming through the progression of this story. So in Wide Sargasso Sea, we have Bertha becoming Antoinette. So she has these kinds of two names. We'll see her originally as Antoinette in our story and then later being called Bertha. And Bertha/Antoinette is older than the character Jane Eyre. So Wide Sargasso Sea is going to begin years before the events of the original novel, and then eventually it's going to catch up. So by the time we get to the end of our story, we'll see the almost intersection of those characters of Jane Eyre and Antoinette/Bertha. And again, this is something that can be a little bit confusing. So in the module, there's going to be some links to video clips to give you some background. And this can also be a standalone story. It's meant to be something that you can just read for itself. Our author, Rhys, is going to be imagining, though, that a lot of her readers would already be familiar with Jane Eyre, as it's a classic story. But again, if you haven't read Jane Eyre before, that's okay. You'll still be able to get through this story, and then if you want a little bit more background, you can go ahead and check out the module to see those videos. Some of them, though, I would say don't watch the clips until we get to the end of the story. So once you've read the whole of Wide Sargasso Sea and see where our character ends up, then go ahead and watch those clips. You can see where that overlap, that intersection happens. Wide Sargasso Sea also revises the timeline of the events a little bit since it's set in 1830s and 1840s. So because of kind of the constraints of trying to tell this story and putting it in a different setting to start off with than where Jane Eyre starts off, that's why we have the author doing it this way. So a little bit of a changing of the timeline. It's not going to throw you off when you're reading. Again, if you're someone who hasn't read Jane Eyre, don't even worry about it. If you're someone who read Jane Eyre and you were wondering, when does this happen? It's going to be a little bit different than what you might have expected. If you're reading the Norton Critical Edition version of Wide Sargasso Sea, you're going to find excerpts from Jane Eyre towards the back of the book on pages 119 through 132. And these will also be a way to show you where the novels intersect with each other, so where they're kind of in conversation. You don't have to read those sections, but I would encourage you, if you have our Norton Critical Editions, if you don't have that edition, again, it's okay. This is just to help us kind of bridge that gap if you're curious of how they speak to each other a little bit more. So we're going to start with some part 1 review questions. So where does the novel take place? So we have our characters living in Jamaica. And question 2 here, they say when trouble comes, close ranks. And so the white people did, but we were not in their ranks. I want you to think about what this tells the reader about Antoinette's family. So Antoinette's family has been slave owners until this point, and then slavery has been abolished in Jamaica. And so now they've lost their source of income and they have fallen into the lowest class because they don't have any income. And so her family's not going to be seen differently. There's going to be the people who are former slaves who now are going to want revenge on the family, or who are going to want those slaveholding families to leave the island, understandably. So this is where the conflict comes in. But Antoinette, being a child when these events occur, isn't going to understand all of that. So she doesn't fully grasp why her family is seen differently. She just sees that there are some white people who don't want them to join their society, and the people who are former slaves aren't going to get along with them either. Going on to 3 here, Antoinette describes the garden at her childhood home. What is the significance of her description? So go back to those pages. How does Antoinette describe the garden? What does she think of it? It's really a safe space for her. It's kind of like an Eden. And I want you to think about the spaces that Antoinette inhabits. How does she feel when she's in a home versus when she's outside? And why might she take more comfort in being outside? So just something to think about as you go through the rest of the novel, because this is going to be kind of a hint about what's to come in the story a little bit. Next question here. What is the relationship between Antoinette and her mother like? So her mother, Annette, is trying to kind of take care of the family, hold them together still, and take care of Antoinette's younger brother who has special needs. And so Antoinette is kind of pushed aside a little bit. They have a very strained relationship. It's not the strongest. Antoinette's going to have trouble forming some relationships throughout her life, as we see in the text. And then we have Christophine, who was originally a slave, who is now freed but is still working as a servant for the family. And Christophine becomes this surrogate mother for Antoinette in a way. So she takes care of Antoinette. She stays with her as she grows up when she can, stays in touch with her. We'll see her come up again later in the novel. So Christophine, even though she has her own son and is now freed and is working as a servant, she still stays in the home and is very close with Antoinette and kind of sees that her mother has pushed her away, and so is very kind to her. All right, what does Tia steal from Antoinette? So Tia is another young girl. Her parents are former slaves, and Tia is going to steal Antoinette's clothes when they go swimming. So here we have a situation where the children originally come to the swimming pool dressed in the clothes that would show their class, would kind of show their rank on the island. And when they leave, there's been this reversal where Tia is kind of establishing that she is now part of the class that is going to be on the rise, that is going to become more prominent, and Antoinette, her family is kind of a relic from the past, so she's going to wear the old tattered clothes. So they've switched here. Going on, we have a wedding scene where Antoinette's mother marries Mr. Mason, and this is a kind of call out to Antoinette's name as Bertha Mason in the original novel. So Antoinette's mother marries a Mr. Mason, and she does this for stability. She does this because the family is running out of money. They have this house, but they really can't take care of themselves anymore. So it's mainly a marriage of convenience. What happens to Antoinette's childhood home? So a group of former slaves comes and burns down the house, and so the family has to flee. Number 9 here, what happens to her brother and the bird? So they are killed because of the fire. So the bird has had its wings clipped. It's not able to fly away. And her brother has smoke inhalation. If you weren't sure what's happening there, her brother has smoke inhalation, so he's not going to make it out of this catastrophe. So she loses both of them in this scene. And for some readers, it's a little bit disturbing that Antoinette really puts more focus, it seems, Antoinette as the narrator, puts more focus on losing the bird than her brother. But we want to keep in mind here that we're getting a bit of a flashback to Antoinette as a child. We're going to see her as an adult later in the story. But here she's bringing us her perspective as a child, basically, on this event. And we've seen that she's not that close with her mother. She's not really close with her brother, but she can sympathize with the bird. So again, upsetting that she's not more upset about her brother, but she's a very young child when this happens, and she's not really kind of thinking of things the same way we might think about it, that we would expect her to be upset about a brother and not the animal, but her sympathies are a little bit misaligned here. Going on to 10, why does Tia throw a rock at Antoinette? So as the family is leaving the house, Tia's family is coming towards them, and Tia throws a rock at Antoinette and hurts her, and Antoinette is going to feel betrayed. Here we see Tia acting like the adults are acting. So she's kind of mimicking, there's been this fire that started, there's this aggression, and so Tia is throwing the rock because she sees Antoinette now as the enemy, as representing the oppressor, and so Tia has picked up on what Antoinette hasn't. Tia has a more thorough understanding of the history of slavery on the island than Antoinette does. So Antoinette's confused, she feels betrayed, And Tia, on her end, may feel as though she has to participate. She has to show that she can't sympathize with the former slave owners. Going on here, on to 11, why is Antoinette afraid her hair will grow back darker? So this is where we see that idea of racism being taught. That again, Antoinette before now wasn't fully aware of the situation. She's trying to kind of pick up on what's been going on about the history of where she lives. But Antoinette, as far as she knows, sees that people who have a darker complexion and darker skin are treated differently. Even though slavery is ended, she knows that there's still racism on the island. She's kind of picking up on it. She wouldn't know what to call it. But she's afraid that when her hair grows back after the fire, that if it's darker, that she will be treated differently. So she's starting to pick up on these things. Going on to 12 here, which relative is she sent to stay with as she recovers? So she's sent to live with her aunt, and then she's going to be sent to a convent school. Going on to 13 here, why can't Antoinette live with her mother anymore? So her mother has become very depressed after the fire, after losing her son. Again, Antoinette's brother died, so her mother is dealing with something that today we would see someone hopefully go to therapy to kind of get help with, but that wouldn't have been available at this time. And so her mother is just written off as being crazy and has to go live somewhere else and be taken care of. And so Antoinette, for her own safety, is separated from her mother. Going on to 14, what do the children who bully Antoinette compare her mother to? So we see the word zombie come up a few times in the text. This is one of those instances. And the zombie that we see in the text is going to be different than what we might think of a zombie as being. So we often, in our own perception of zombies, if you think of Hollywood, if you think of shows like The Walking Dead, we think of a zombie as being someone who's come back from the dead. But in this historical context, there's a different view of a zombie. So a zombie can be someone brought back from the dead, but it can also be someone who's alive, whose soul is gone, or who's been taken over, or is being possessed by something. And so that's what the children are comparing her mother to, that she's alive, but she's kind of this shell, and she's not really herself anymore. And so they're bullying Antoinette, and we're starting to get that foreshadowing that people think that maybe Antoinette is going to become like her mother. And so this is going to further drive a wedge between Antoinette and her mother. Going on here, what does Antoinette refer to Sandy Causeway as? So Sandy Causeway is technically Antoinette's nephew. This is something that can be confusing. Depending on what version of the text you're reading, there will be a footnote that clarifies the situation. But if we think back, Antoinette's biological father had died, but before he died, he had other wives and other partners besides her mother, besides Annette. So she has several half-siblings, and some of those half-siblings are older than her and have their own children. So Sandy Causeway, she calls her cousin. She just uses this as like a catch-all term for people she knows are vaguely related to her that are her age, so just cousin, but he's actually her nephew. So if you were confused about that, that's actually her nephew. And again, she's not fully aware of how they're related. She hasn't quite put all of that together to think of him as a nephew because they're both young, they're both kids. Going on to 17, where is Antoinette sent to live and attend school? I've already mentioned that in our other slide. She is sent to a convent, so she's going to be going to a religious school here. She's going to be raised there because her mother can't take care of her, and Mr. Mason doesn't want to be responsible for her yet. So she is sent there, and that's where she's going to basically grow up until she's old enough to get married. Going on to 18, how does Antoinette feel about her life in this new environment? So go back through those pages where she's at the school and think about how you see her reacting to the school, to the people there. We see that she has nightmares, and it's kind of this mixed reaction in that it's a place that's comforting in a way, that it's solid, that she has a roof over her head, that there's a routine, so there's that. But on the other hand, she's been separated from her family, and she's somewhat frightened by the religious texts at the school. So she's not quite sure what to do. She doesn't really have any agency. We've talked about agency before as far as what characters can do, what choices they can make. Antoinette, as a minor and as a woman at this time, can't really do much about what's happening. She just has to stay there until someone gets her out. So going to 19, who visits Antoinette at the school, that's going to be her stepfather, Mr. Mason, and he's basically checking on her as he grows up to try and prepare for when she's old enough to get married, because there's not really much else for her to do. She's in this kind of fallen from upper class state where she is either going to get married or she would have to find an occupation, and she hasn't been prepared to find an occupation, to find a job. So Mr. Mason's going to visit and bring her gifts and kind of prepare her for that marriage. Now, this is a scene, these parts when he visits her, can be kind of strange for students to think of, why is he bringing her these gifts? She can't wear the gifts at the school. She has to wear a uniform. She's overseen by nuns. She's supposed to be very modest, but he's basically kind of preparing her with these gifts that she'll have to take with her when she gets married someday. It's a strange thing, but he's not creeping on her. Occasionally, we have people who get confused and think that Mr. Mason wants to marry her. He does not want to marry her. He's just trying to find a husband for her when she's old enough so that he doesn't have to take care of her. So we're seeing that he does not want to be involved with her. He's distancing himself from his wife Annette and from Antoinette here, and just getting her ready for adulthood as he sees it. So going on to part 2 here, we're going to have a bit of a time jump. So part 2 is going to start after Antoinette gets married. So we have a new narrator who's never actually named, but the character, her husband, is going to be a Mr. Rochester. So he's going to be the main male figure from Jane Eyre. So we're just going to call him Mr. Rochester in the PowerPoint just to make that easier. Him not being named in the text is kind of to add some mystery, and so that Jean Rhys isn't as directly making a reference to Jane Eyre. So it lets her space it out just a little bit. So he's going to be our new narrator for this section. And there is a young woman named Amelie who laughs at Mr. Rochester. I want you to think of why she might laugh at him. So she is from a lower class than him, but she seems to think there's some kind of joke on him happening. So I want you to kind of think back about that scene. Why would she laugh at him? What does that kind of suggest? And going on to 3 here, what does Mr. Rochester assume about the name of the town Massacre? So he assumes that there's been a massacre in the town, as you might expect. Why name it a town Massacre if there hadn't been something? And yet Antoinette, when she answers him about it, doesn't really think that that happened. She's not sure what happened there. So we're seeing, again, Antoinette's kind of ignorance about history coming out a little bit here. Going to question 4, what does Mr. Rochester think about the colors of the island? So I want you to try and answer that one yourself. How do you view him viewing the island? So what is his impression of it? And then going on to 5, what does Mr. Rochester think of the servants at the house? So we see him becoming uncomfortable around the servants, and there would have been servants in England at this time as well. So if you've read Jane Eyre, you would be familiar with some of those characters, but the servants that Mr. Rochester has been around would be people who were lower class, people of European descent. He wouldn't have been around as many people of Jamaican descent before this time, or of African descent either. So he's uncomfortable with the racial difference here, and the way the servants are talking to Antoinette and to him, and also the way they dress and kind of the way they act. So we see him uncomfortable in this situation because he's normally used to being kind of in control of things as being the white man in the area, and now he's realizing that he is feeling a little bit outnumbered by these people who have a shared history together, and that he may not be as kind of dominant as he thinks he is. Going on to 6, how does Mr. Rochester remember the wedding? If you think back to the scene, he doesn't really remember it that well. It's kind of a blur. He was there, but he's kind of more concerned about what he's going to do now. Going on to 7, when Antoinette says she's afraid of what might happen, what do you think she means? And this is when we have a flashback scene where Mr. Rochester is recalling a bit of their conversation before they got married. So what do you think she means by that? Going on to 8, what is Antoinette's impression of England, even though she has never been there? This is going to be a question that kind of relates to more parts of the story than just this early scene with them together talking about where he's from. So again, Mr. Rochester is going to be from England. He's come to Jamaica to marry Antoinette and then take her on their honeymoon. They're to visit another part of the islands. And so he's telling Antoinette about it, and Antoinette kind of sees England as a dream. She knows it's a real place, but she's not quite sure about it because she's never been there. Her mother always wanted to go there. So she has kind of mixed feelings about it. She's, of course, going to feel safer in a place she's used to. And then we start to learn about different superstitions. So I want you to go find this part in the story. So what superstition do we learn about that Antoinette has? All right, going on to number 10 here. Why is Mr. Rochester annoyed by Christophine coming into the room? So the easy answer that some people have for this one is that Christophine wakes them up in the morning. They're on their honeymoon. She comes and wakes them up. The other part of this could be that Mr. Rochester wants privacy with his new wife, so they want to be intimate, and he doesn't like that Christophine, this kind of motherly figure, is coming into the room and interrupting their privacy. So we have him, again, trying to show more possession over Antoinette, and Christophine, again, just being a motherly figure to Antoinette, is coming to check on her. Going on to 11. So this is another one that's going to be a little bit more open-ended. Do you think it's odd that Mr. Rochester likes swimming in the bathing pool? So go to that page, look at that scene. Is it odd that he likes swimming in the bathing pool? Why would he want to go to this isolated area? You can think of how Antoinette interacts with the bathing pool. Going on to 12 here. What is Antoinette obsessed with, particularly at night? So this is going to be where the story starts to take even more of a turn. It starts to get a little bit dark. We see Antoinette is obsessed with death. And if we're wondering why is she obsessed with death when she's on her honeymoon, we may want to consider how many people she's lost or how many people have been separated from her either because of death or another situation. So Antoinette's lost a lot of people that she cared about, from her mother, her brother, her stepfather has moved away from her. So she's lost a lot of these people. And so she's thinking about, when it's at night, when there's nothing else to do, she's starting to think about death. And we also see death become a euphemism in this section as well. And that leads us to 13. What does the couple do most of the day? The couple is knowing each other in a biblical sense, but they're not getting to know each other really as people. So we have a very physical relationship that starts forming. We don't have the couple really talking to each other that much about their past or their future. And so we're seeing this dissonance that's starting to form. It's going to be an issue for them later on. Going on to 14, what does the letter that Mr. Rochester receives say, and who is it from? So I mentioned before, again, that Antoinette has half-siblings. So one of these half-siblings is a man named Daniel, and he's going to be writing to Mr. Rochester to try and warn him about her family. So this is a half-sibling who Antoinette is not close with, is a half-sibling who does not like her, and so he's going to start trying to kind of get in the way of this relationship. Going on to 15, why does Antoinette slap Amelie? So Amelie is poking fun at them, is making jokes, and is trying to embarrass Antoinette, and so Antoinette is going to slap her. And then Christophine's going to step in and threaten Amelie, trying to remind her of their social ranking of where they're at, because Amelie is kind of trying to assert herself as being closer to Antoinette than Antoinette would like. Going on to 17, who used to live in the house that Mr. Rochester comes across on his walk. So he comes across an abandoned house that belonged to a priest, and this is going to be a house that makes the other people on the island uncomfortable. They're going to see this as possibly being like a haunted house. It's associated with a religion that is not shared by the other people on the island, and so what would just be kind of a creepy house because it's abandoned also has this kind of spiritual association with it as well. And then we have Mr. Rochester finding a book, and the book is going to be about those zombies we had mentioned before, among other things, but he reads about that zombie, and so we're going to have again that reminder that people are starting to wonder if Antoinette could become like her mother Annette and start to kind of lose her mind a little bit. And again, this is a situation that's not being treated the same way we would treat things today. We can see in retrospect that Antoinette's mother, Annette, may have dealt with things like postpartum depression, with anxiety, and with other issues that we would talk about and treat today, and she could get help for, and she wouldn't be isolated. But in this time period, we're getting the emphasis on women not getting the mental health care that they should for these different situations. And so it's easier for Mr. Rochester to start to connect his wife to her mother and start to kind of push away from her a little bit after this. Going on to 19, what is Obeah? So Obeah is part of the religion of some of the islanders, such as Christophine, and it's also associated a little bit with magic. So it's part spirituality, part religion, and part a little bit of magic. Going back to Antoinette's perspective, so we switch back to Annette and what she's doing. And she's gone to Christophine for some counsel to find out what she should do about her relationship, because she can see that it's going to be falling apart pretty early. And Christophine says, a man like that will hate Antoinette. So I want you to think why Christophine would say a man like that will hate Antoinette. Why is Christophine sure that's going to be very hard for Antoinette to gain Mr. Rochester's affections? Going on to 21, what does Christophine think Antoinette should do about her relationship with Mr. Rochester? So Christophine suggests that she leave, that she kind of say she's going on a vacation, go to another town, and then slowly pull away from him that way to dissolve their relationship. Going on to 22, how does Christophine feel about England? So Christophine doesn't really see it as a real place, and this is where Antoinette starts to doubt Christophine a little bit, that Antoinette knows that it's a real country, and Christophine is kind of seeing it out of sight, out of mind. If she can't see it, it's not really real to her. So again, Antoinette's going to have some doubt here that if it's this place that she wants to go to, how could Christophine not see that it's real? Going on to 23, what does Antoinette want Christophine to give to her? And this part's a little bit more ambiguous, but Christophine does give her something. In Antoinette's mind, it's a love potion. In reality, because the story is somewhat historical fiction in a way, we can't have real magic in the story. So what we can see Christophine giving Antoinette is not really a love potion, but some kind of herbal drug, something that's going to affect Mr. Rochester later on. So Christophine gives her this thing that's seen as magic to try and solve her relationship. Going on to 24, what did Aunt Cora leave Antoinette? How can this help her? So she leaves her a couple of items, and this is something that may come up on a quiz or a test later, so I'm not going to give you this answer just yet. But what did Aunt Cora leave Antoinette, and how can it help her? And one of the things to keep in mind is that Antoinette can't really own property. She can't have her own money, but she can have some sorts of jewelry, hint, hint. She can have clothes. She can have things that are worth money. So if someone gives her an object to wear, she can keep that and then sell it later. But in the short term here, when she's with Mr. Rochester, she can't have just money at her own expense or for her own disposal unless he allows her to. Anything that she had from her mother or her father then becomes his property. That's why he's married her, is for that. So this is where things become kind of difficult for her, that it's only those objects that she can use as currency. Going on here to Mr. Rochester's perspective, so we flip back again. I want you to think of, what is Daniel like? Why do you think Daniel Cosway has such a problem with his half-sister Antoinette? 26, what does Daniel warn Mr. Rochester about in regards to Christophine? So he warns him about the Obeah, that Christophine has this magic, that she could use it to hurt someone who gets in her way or who she doesn't like. Going to 27, what does Daniel imply about Antoinette and Sandy? So he implies that they've had a relationship with each other, a romantic relationship. And something to keep in mind as we go through this is that, again, Antoinette is not quite fully aware, it seems, of how she and Sandy are related. She's not thinking of this as an incestuous relationship, really. So there's more innocence to this than it may seem in the story, but Daniel is trying to use this as a sort of blackmail against them, to say that this is what your wife did, and also to imply that she lost her virginity before the marriage, which at this time would be seen as a big issue for Mr. Rochester and Antoinette's relationship. Going on to 28 here, what does the word Bekke mean? So Bekke is going to mean white people, and usually white people who are foreigners, so that's going to be someone like Mr. Rochester. But it can also be used sometimes just to mean white people in general. So we have Christophine warning Antoinette that Bekke shouldn't meddle with the Obeah, that they shouldn't try and use that magic. Going on to 29, what does the pet name Dodo mean? So this is what Christophine calls Antoinette, and this is complimentary. This is a word kind of like darling or dear one. It's a pet name, so it's an affectionate term that she has for Antoinette that we'll see Mr. Rochester use later on to refer to how Christophine talks to her, as we see him using other names that Antoinette doesn't like. Going on here to 30, when Mr. Rochester returns from visiting Daniel, how does his conversation with Antoinette go? So here I want you to note down what their conversation is about. Going on to 31, what does Antoinette mean when she says there are always two deaths, the real one and the one people know about? So people interpret this line some different ways. We could have the real death being the loss of sense of self, so not a real physical death, but kind of a mental or emotional or spiritual death, and the one people know about being the death when someone's physical body dies. But other people sometimes think of this in other ways, and we have Mr. Rochester following this quote by saying, basically, if someone's lucky, there's just the two. So Antoinette says there's two deaths, the real one and the one people know about, but I want you to think of how that could be interpreted in different ways. Going on to 32, why does Mr. Rochester think they should talk in the daylight? So we can see that he's becoming uncomfortable with their conversation. He doesn't want to hear too much of Antoinette's reasons for her, the way she is, or hear about too much about her life, because then she's going to sound more rational, or she's going to get more of her side of the story out. He kind of finds it easier to kind of silence her and just think on his own about what's been happening. Going on to 33, what do you think of Antoinette's account of the events of her childhood? So she has this conversation with Mr. Rochester where she again is trying to kind of explain what her life's been like, and he's trying to silence her. So what do you think of this scene? Going on to 34, what is it that Antoinette seems to do to Mr. Rochester? What has happened? This is where he's drugged with something, and then they sleep together, and then he wakes up and is upset about it. So again, we don't have actual magic in the story, but we do have some sort of drug that's being used here. Going on to 35, what do Mr. Rochester and Christophine talk about? They talk about Antoinette. This is another one where I want you to kind of fill in their two perspectives, how they feel about her in this part of the story. And then going on to 36, this is another one that's a little bit more open-ended. Why won't Mr. Rochester let Antoinette go even though he does not love her? And part of this is a more obvious answer, that we have the money aspect of things, that again, he has gotten all of the money that her family had set aside for her dowry, so he's inherited her inheritance basically. But if he lets her go, then he has to give that up and has to let whoever is next to take care of her have that money, whether the money goes back to her brother, because she has a stepbrother, Mr. Mason's son, who kind of set up part of the marriage. So he would oversee her finances, or her next husband would get that money. So he's trying to look out for his own financial situation here. Now, we haven't talked about this just yet. If you weren't sure why he would be so focused on this marriage, Mr. Rochester has an older brother, and his older brother is set to get the inheritance from their father. So there was a rule at this time in England that the firstborn son, would get the inheritance from the father, and the second son would kind of have to figure things out for himself. And people could go about this in different ways. A father could say, well, I'm going to actually give the first son most of the property, but I'll save a little bit for the younger son. But we've seen that Mr. Rochester's father is not planning on doing that, and so he's just going to leave the first son everything, and Mr. Rochester has to fend for himself by marrying someone with money. So Antoinette is marrying someone for kind of protection, someone to take care of her and manage her finances, and Mr. Rochester has married her to get those finances. So the motives here for both of them, definitely not ideal, and that's part of why he's not letting her go, is to be possessive of her in that way. But as you're reading, you may think of other reasons why he's trying to control her still and won't let her go. Going on to part 3 now. So again, if you haven't read all the way up to here, you may want to stop now before we get into spoilers, but otherwise, if you've finished reading Wide Sargasso Sea, feel free to keep going. So 3, what is Antoinette's life like in England? Does she understand where she is? So this is where we catch up to Jane Eyre. So we talked before about Antoinette, or Bertha, being referred to as the madwoman in the attic. Now we see where that comes from. So when they get to England, Mr. Rochester doesn't want anything to do with her anymore. He's tried to make her seem like she's a drunk, like she's crazy, and so he shuts her up in an attic. So she's trapped there, and if you didn't catch for how long she's there for years. So he locks her up there for years, and this is where we catch up with Jane Eyre, where he's found another woman, Jane Eyre, who he falls in love with and wants to marry her and kind of shut Antoinette out. He needs to pretend she doesn't exist. Antoinette, as you may have picked up on, tries to leave the attic. She makes it out of the attic a couple of times and finally ends up setting the house on fire, and then she will jump off the roof. The fire part is clearer in our book. The jumping off the roof is where we bridge with our story, Jane Eyre, and this is a part that can be hard to understand because if Antoinette's our narrator, she can't really tell us about those last moments, but we see in Jane Eyre that she has jumped off the roof and is not quite fully aware of what that's going to do to her, that she's going to be committing suicide. So a very sad part of the story here. And again, we were talking before about why Jean Rhys would write this story. She is giving more of a background, kind of showing why Bertha Mason would be that way in Jane Eyre by giving her this backstory. This is all that she went through. This is what leads someone to those extremes. And so this is where Antoinette ends up. If you've read Jane Eyre, or if you haven't, we'll kind of get to where that ties in. Because she's passed away, then Mr. Rochester is free to marry Jane Eyre, and that story ends with their marriage and finding out what happens to their life. So Mr. Rochester is seen as one of the protagonists in Jane Eyre being the main protagonist, but he's seen as the love interest. Here we have that changing where he becomes a bit more of an antagonist to Antoinette in the original story to explain where she ends up. All right, so let's go over, now that we've gone through the story, go through some symbols and motifs. So symbols are going to be things that are like objects. Motifs are going to be recurring ideas. And we had some confusion before in some of our earlier modules about a motif versus a motive. So a motive is why someone does something. A motif is different. So M-O-T-I-F-S. Motifs are recurring ideas. And a lot of times we'll kind of use the word theme to mean motif, but a motif is just a very short idea or concept. A theme is going to be a little bit more involved. It's kind of the next step of a motif. So our symbols are going to be fire, clothes, and the parrot. So things that kind of come up or represent other things in the story. So we have the fire that happens at Antoinette's childhood home, and then we have the fire she sets at the end. And both of these scenes can be seen as the destruction of something, obviously the destruction of homes, but also a chance for rebirth or renewal. So after the first fire, Antoinette has lost a lot of things. She's lost her home, she's lost her brother, she's lost the parrot, but it's also a loss of innocence in a way, and a loss of her past and her childhood, and she has to move forward and grow up after this scene. If we look at the last fire, even though it's a very sad moment in the story, it's her way of kind of reclaiming herself and trying to assert something over Mr. Rochester because she's lost control until this point. So the fire there is burning down his house, burning down the attic that trapped her, burning that prison, and she's, again, not fully aware of what she's doing. She doesn't see herself as dying in that moment. She thinks that she's going on to something else. Going on to clothing, if you go back through the story, you'll notice that Antoinette becomes fixated on clothing at a few different points. So we have the moment where Tia steals her clothing and she has to go home. Antoinette has to go home in more tattered clothing, and her mother is somewhat disturbed by it and wants Christophine to get her new outfit. We also have clothes referred to at other moments in her adulthood. So we have the clothes that she wears on her honeymoon. So she has a white dress, and then we have the dress that she's looking for when she's in the attic. So she wants to know where her red dress is. And red is often associated with passion, love, hunger, all of those things. We might also think of the fire. So there's this red dress that she really wants to find towards the end as part of, again, reclaiming herself. So if you missed those instances, maybe go back and think of where you can find clothing in the story and what it might represent. Going on to the parrot as our last symbol that we're just going to touch on here. There's other symbols, but we're going to focus on these here. We've got the parrot whose wings are clipped, and that's going to be in a way foreshadowing what happens to Antoinette at the very end. So just as the parrot tries to jump off of the first house that's burning, it's trying to fly to freedom, we also have Antoinette trying to make that jump at the end, feeling as though she too can fly. So the clipped winged parrot is, again, kind of a parallel for her. Going on then to our motifs, so recurring ideas, we have inheritance and madness, and these can both go together. We have the inheritance of money, of property, all of those things, but we also have this recurring idea of inheriting madness, that people are thinking that Antoinette is going to inherit her mother's madness, that this is hereditary, that she can't really escape it. And this brings up other ideas like fate and free will. How much can we choose and how much are we kind of born into? So those are very much connected, inheritance and madness. We also have the struggle for inheritance that Mr. Rochester has, that he's not going to get inheritance from his father, and so he feels like he has to figure out some other way to care for himself. We have Antoinette inheriting a little bit with her dowry, but again, that money's going to go towards Mr. Rochester instead of herself, so the only thing she can really inherit is her family history and those rings from her aunt, so that's all coming through again. So as I was saying with our other questions, if you want to take any other notes on this, I would again pause the recording, go through, and if you want to write down any thoughts I was just giving you about those, but feel free to add your other ideas as well about any of those symbols or motifs, because there are different ways to interpret them. And then lastly, here we have some follow-up questions for you to think about. So the first one here, what is the impact of the story switching perspectives / narrators? This is going to come up in our discussion board, so we're just starting it off here. Question 2, the rest of these won't be as related to our discussion board, but the first one is, so there's a hint there. Going on to 2, how has Antoinette developed as a character? So how do you see her growth from the start of the story to the end? Question 3, why doesn't Antoinette move to another town or leave Jamaica altogether? 4, how do Antoinette and Mr. Rochester see nature differently? And then lastly, why is Antoinette's husband never named? So again, in Jane Eyre, his name is Edward Rochester, but in that novel, he's almost always referred to as Mr. Rochester. In White Sargasso Sea, he's never actually given a name. So again, I've referred to him as Mr. Rochester for simplicity, so you know who I'm talking about. It's Antoinette's husband. But the story, Jane Eyre is going to treat him a little bit differently than White Sargasso Sea. So why is he never named in White Sargasso Sea? So these follow-up questions are all things that I want you to kind of think about on your own. Again, you can take notes on paper. You can fill in the notes in the PowerPoint that mimics this PowerPoint. But either way, just some questions to think about as we wrap up the story here. So that's going to bring us to the end of Wide Sargasso Sea. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, make sure you send me an email or a Canvas message. With that, if we're thinking about things to work on this week, make sure that you go through the module and check out the links and articles and videos that we have in there. And then we are also going to have discussion board number 4 that's going to be due on Sunday the 11th, so make sure that you're checking that out as well. Again, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, make sure you let me know. Otherwise, have a good rest of your day.